phrase, doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, describes a character, or real person for that matter, who, despite committing acts that are, on paper, wrong, has motivations for doing so that are presented as honourable or sympathetic, allowing you to, if not justify their actions, at least understand why they did what they did. Take Sandman from Spider-Man 3, a man turning to a life of crime in order to pay for his daughter's cancer treatment. Though he's undoubtedly done horrible things, his reasons for doing so are understandable, admirable even, and it helps endear the audience to someone that might otherwise be unlikable. We aren't talking about those kind of characters today. Instead, we'll be looking at something I find far more interesting. A character doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason, but pretending that they're doing it for a good reason. Deluding everyone around them, perhaps even themselves, that they're doing these horrible things for a good reason, only for it to be revealed that their motives are ultimately self-serving. And two of the most prominent examples of this in the last decade are Walter White of Breaking Bad and Eren Yeager of Attack on Titan. Given the acclaim and success both of these shows have enjoyed, I'm pretty sure most people watching have seen at least one, let alone both of them, and if you have, you might be wondering how their protagonists have anything in common, given how different they and the media they spawn from are. Breaking Bad is a neo-noir crime drama that is primarily dialogue-driven with slower pacing and little in the way of conventional action. Attack on Titan is a post-apocalyptic, quasi-war dark fantasy full of violence and spectacle, though it does eventually transition into a more character-driven rumination on the nature of humanity and the violence seemingly inherent to its nature. Not a terrible amount of overlap, at least in terms of premise or initial tone, and on the surface this extends to their protagonists. Walter White is a 50-year-old high school chemistry teacher who takes up a side gig as a meth kingpin to spare his family from the costs of his cancer treatment. And Eren Yeager is a child soldier with anger issues out to kill everything and everyone that gets in the way of his freedom, be they giant naked cannibals, or a child who just happened to be born on the other side of the sea. But, despite these differences, I'd argue that Eren and Walter are very similar not in their motivations, but in the way their motivations evolve and are presented throughout their respective series. They're both characters who, despite doing their best to justify their actions to everyone around them, deep down know there's only one person benefiting from them: themselves.
That's right. Now, say my name. Heisenberg. You're goddamn right.
Walter H. White's transformation into the ruthless drug lord Heisenberg is one of the most infamous character arcs in television. Over the course of 5 seasons, we see Walter slowly embed himself more and more into the drug trade, becoming ever more willing to commit ever more violent crimes to keep his position secure. In Season 1, he spends a whole episode debating whether or not to kill someone, doing so with extreme hesitance only when he realizes his captee plans on killing him. Cut to Seasons 4 and 5 where he's blowing up care homes, poisoning kids, and shooting up a room full of people. To be fair to Walt, that room was full of Nazis, but still pretty ruthless. Long story short, Walter did many terrible things over the course of the show, but he kept going, motivated by his love for his family and his need to provide for them. Or was he? Throughout the show, Walter has multiple opportunities to call it quits, multiple chances where he's had enough, where he doesn't need to keep doing what he's doing, where he can just enjoy a peaceful life with his family. But each and every time, Walter pushes forward. He doesn't take those chances, he keeps upping the ante, and each time he does it, the harder and harder it becomes to believe that he's really just doing this for his family. This eventually culminates in a scene in the final episode where, in his final talk with Skylar, Walter, Heisenberg, admits that at the root of it, he did it all for himself. He chose to drown in a world of blue because he enjoyed the power it gave him, the rush, the thrill. He enjoyed putting his skill to use in a field he could dominate, and allowed the drug trade to corrupt and transform him into the monster he died as. But is that really how it went? Walter does indeed change over the course of this show, that much is undeniable, but I don't think it's right to say that Heisenberg was something forced upon Walt, like he started off totally innocent, but was corrupted by the environment he was in. Yes, Walter had cancer, and yes, the American healthcare system is a bitch, but meth wasn't his first option. He had a solution handed to him in the form of Gretchen and Elliot. They offered him a well-paying job that he not only would have enjoyed much more than his current one, but would have come with health insurance that would have covered his treatment. In fact, fuck the job. They were willing to just straight up pay for his treatment. What was stopping him? It was Heisenberg. Heisenberg wasn't just a separate alter ego that grew to consume Walter. He was always there. In his pride, in his insecurities, the seeds that would become Heisenberg weren't planted by his experiences in the drug trade. They were always there. Patient, dormant, waiting for the right environment in which they could finally flourish. There's a kind of semi-meme about when Walter White became Heisenberg. Personally, there is no moment. Walter doesn't become Heisenberg. He always was. It just took time for that side of him to manifest. From the moment the show began, from the moment Walter met Skylar, from the moment he left Gretchen, from the moment he founded Grey Matter, and maybe even from the moment he was born, Heisenberg has always been a part of him. And while we're on that train of thought, now is probably as good a time as any to move on to Eren fucking Yeager. I told myself I wouldn't talk about Attack on Titan for a good few years at least, but something about it just keeps dragging me back, kicking and screaming. If you're familiar with the channel, then you probably already know that I've already done a video about Eren Yeager discussing the intricacies of his character. I'll be covering a lot of similar ground here, but if you'd like a more exhaustive analysis focused solely on him, then just click in the card in the top right corner. But otherwise, let's get right into it. Eren's character arc is somehow both more subtle and more obvious than Walter's in that the story beats you over the head with what's happened by the end, but if you're not paying too close attention as it's happening, it can easily be missed. Up until the last 8 or 9 chapters, it seems that Eren's rumbling is motivated by a desire to protect his homeland of Paradis, as well as to ensure that his friends live long, peaceful lives. And while that's no doubt a big part of it, it's eventually revealed that he has a hidden motivation that runs even deeper. What truly drives Eren to wipe out humanity is an entitled desire to reduce the Earth to the picture book he saw in his childhood. A vast, empty world devoid of life, free for him to relish and play in, like a child in a sandbox. Obviously, his desire to protect his friends was a strong one, but in his gut, what was truly pushing him forward was that infantile disappointment that he wasn't the only person in the world. Sure, he had his Lelouch-style plan to have his friends kill him and be revered as world heroes, but honestly, it feels like something he came up with after the fact to retroactively justify his base want to kill all human life. The aim of that plan was supposedly to save his friends and ensure them long life, but he gets 2 of them killed in the process and admits that even more could have died. He had no guarantee they would win. They could have been killed in the Battle of Shiganshina, killed by the rumbling if they were in the wrong place, eaten by one of Zeke's titans that he just let wander about. They could have been killed by the Yeagerists at the port, and he could have killed them himself when they did finally reach him. And if they did die, he would have just kept going. Fuck 80%, he would have gone all the way. Like I said, it really feels like the plan for his friends was something he came up with after deciding to rumble the world so he'd feel less guilty about it, which, I mean, at least he does feel guilty about it. I imagine that's very comforting to the millions of children he crushed. So those are our 2 arseholes, different in circumstance yet similar in progression, though progression might be the wrong word to use. Indeed, one of the things I find so interesting about these characters is the implication that they don't progress. The idea that they were never truly corrupted but had these darker elements lurking there all this time not only intrigues me, but adds a whole layer of tragedy to their stories. Were they always destined to go down the paths they did? And if they didn't, would they truly be at peace with themselves? I don't know. And I love that. Now, along with these similarities, the two are also interesting in how they differ. As I mentioned earlier, Eren's stagnant character is at once more subtle but also more obvious than Walter's. Unlike the latter, who, aside from a really nasty prideful streak, does come across as a harmless, mild-mannered teacher, there's very clearly something wrong with Eren from the beginning. He kills 2 men at age 9 and walks it off. Like, children in this world aren't just total psychopaths. Mikasa comes out completely changed by the experience. But as far as we can tell, Eren doesn't even think about it until 6 years later when it's brought up by someone else. With this in mind, it's no wonder that the story begins posing the question of whether Eren's truly changed over the years, or if he was always the kind of person who would eventually wipe out humanity. Another thing I find interesting is that although Eren's actions are infinitely more destructive and horrendous than Heisenberg's, he's ultimately shown to be far more remorseful and conflicted over what he's doing, which, to be fair, he should be, but it's still an interesting comparison. Although Walter has moments of regret, of knowing he's gone too far, by the end of the series, it's clear that he doesn't really think he's done anything wrong. Throughout it all, he self-righteously justifies himself by saying he's doing it for the family, but when he admits that to be just an excuse, he doesn't look terribly torn up about it, just more at peace, as if he's relieved that he could finally be honest about his intentions for once. And although he's clearly sad to have lost his family, he doesn't give the vibe of someone actually feeling remorse over their actions. If anything, he's proud of how far he's come and what he's achieved, and when he dies, he's satisfied, surrounded by his true love, in a sense, having won. Eren, on the other hand, is fucking miserable. We find out his true intentions by him breaking down and crying in front of a child who can't understand him and who he knows is going to be dead within a year. During the actual rumbling itself, he mentally regresses and disassociates from the whole thing just to cope with the guilt. And when Mikasa is about to land the killing blow, I mean, just look at him. I know people joke about Reiner wanting to kill himself, but this right here, this is the face of a man who wants nothing more than the sweet release of death. And yet, he did it anyway. Despite knowing how irredeemable what he was doing was, he still did it. And yeah, he felt bad about it, but in a way that makes him worse than Heisenberg. He knows the rumbling is unjustifiable, he knows it's a horrendous thing, but he'd rather have someone else kill him to stop it over just not doing it. It creates this weird kind of doublethink where you're inclined to see him in a more sympathetic light than Walter because he's so tortured, but he kind of ends up being even more hateable because he knows better and has the fucking audacity to do it anyway. I love it. Just, you disgusting human beings, both of you. But that's another interesting point of comparison. The light that we see these characters in, or to put it another way, how the narrative treats them and their actions. I'm sure you're thinking it must be obvious. After all, I've spent the last however many minutes going off about how terrible these characters are as people, but that's what I think. And there are people who take a very different stance. I touched on this in my video dedicated to Eren Yeager, but there is a certain demographic that sees characters like Walter White, Eren Yeager, Michael Corleone, Light Yagami, even Tony Montana as not cautionary tales, but icons of, let's be real here, masculinity to be aspired to. Sigma male grind set goals, if you will. But why is that? After all, I've spent this whole video up until now going on and on and on about how Eren and Walter are bad people. Surely it must be obvious. Well, I am at least 95% sure that Todd Phillips didn't intend for Joker to be an incel rallying cry calling them to take to the streets. I think he wanted to make a character study while exploring issues like mental health and social funding. Just like I'm sure David Fincher didn't intend for Fight Club to be an encouragement of toxic masculinity, and Vince Gilligan didn't intend for Breaking Bad to be a glamorization of drug use and production. And yet people take it that way. Most people know that depiction doesn't automatically equal endorsement, yet many people either choose to ignore this fact or just flat out misinterpret it. And I think therein lies the potential danger for these kind of characters. In their intriguing complexity, their multiple layers, there is space for people to see what they're doing and, I suppose, take them at face value, depending on how explicit the story is in its condemnation of said protagonist. One of the more problematic versions of this can be seen in Attack on Titan and the controversy surrounding its main character. Eren Yeager commits genocide. He kills potentially over 1 billion people, including children and babies. Where could people, outside of blatant fascism, find any reason to support him? Well, the story. Now, the narrative does make it clear that Eren isn't doing a good thing. Most of the final arc is dedicated to all the remaining characters putting aside their differences to stop him, and one of them literally says there's no justifying it. It's genocide, and that's more than enough reason to oppose it. But does it condemn what Eren's doing enough? And that might sound stupid considering what I just said, but think about it. Parody exists in a world that wants them and their race wiped off the map. Many alternate possibilities to resolving the conflict are sought after. But ultimately, the best options people can come up with are sterilize the entire race or force an MAD situation with the entire world by continuing the practice of passing down titans through the royal family. Neither is really ideal, and everyone knows this. Therefore, it's no wonder that people start asking, hey, these people want to kill us, why not kill them first? To put it bluntly, the series has created a situation where genocide is, if not the right option, at least an understandable reaction. You get why people are turning to this. Flock is probably the most blatantly evil character in the series aside from King Fritz and Sergeant Gross. But it feels like the ideals of the Yeagerists are, if nothing else, at least taken seriously. And once you add that nuance to it, well, it's no surprise that people are going to come away supporting them, despite them being literal fascists. Of course, some people do it because they're literal fascists, but... Look, I really don't want to do this anymore. Can we just move on with the video, please? Now, there are ways to get around this, and I think we find a good, or at least better, example of that by returning to Walter White. I think Breaking Bad handles a protagonist being nuanced yet still clearly in the wrong a little bit more tactfully by focusing more on the human consequences of Heisenberg's actions. The problem in Attack on Titan's case is that the Alliance is made up of characters who not only spend most of the arc miles away from Eren and what he's doing, but is also made up of characters who objectively stand to gain from his actions. There's also the fact that Eren is committing an atrocity on such a large scale that it's kind of hard to really feel bad about it. At least until you actually see people dying. Even then, seeing the effects of the rumbling is mostly contained to a few chapters. In Breaking Bad, the scale is cut way back, focusing mostly on the effects Heisenberg's actions have on his family and the people around him. Rather than a big, horrible genocide right at the end of the story, Walter's growing misdeeds and their effects are focused on throughout the show, letting us get intimately familiar with how he is hurting the people around him. We see him slowly drag his wife and children into his world, destroying their relationship and forcing them to become complicit in his crimes. We see him manipulate and hurt not just Jesse, but every person that he comes to love, eventually leaving him to slave for a psychopath and a gang of neo-Nazis. He gets his brother-in-law killed, he gets his brother-in-law's partner killed. We see and feel the damage that Walter is doing. The addition of Jesse as a secondary protagonist definitely helps as well. No main character is a saint, but out of all of them, Jesse is probably one of the few you could genuinely call a good person at heart, even by the end of the show. While Walter becomes more and more callous, Jesse, throughout the whole series, retains a sense of morality, which he does break on occasion, despite his better judgment. But he never loses sight of what's right, of what should have been done, and through him, so do we. To be fair, Attack on Titan also kind of has this in the form of characters like Armin and Falco, the latter being confirmed as having been literally inspired by Jesse. But Jesse is not only given near equal focus to Walter, but practically spends the whole show with him, allowing us to draw a more effective comparison between the two. Despite all of this, we understand that despite how much we might root for Walter or find him sympathetic, his actions are causing undeniable harm and must be stopped. I say that, but of course people idolize him anyway, so I guess all of that was just pointless. I suppose that's just a fundamental risk with this kind of character, which really sucks. I know I've been going off about how terrible Eren and Walter are as people, but that's what makes me love them as characters. Seeing them struggle to reconcile their horrible actions with a supposed sense of justice or familial concern, seeing that struggle get harder and harder the longer the story goes on, and in the end, seeing them admit to it. Admit to being motivated by selfishness, by excuses they know won't fly, brings with it a sense of catharsis. When I first read Eren confessing to Ramsay that the main reason he committed the rumbling is that he was disappointed people existed, I remember feeling my heart sinking in my chest, followed by an almost giddy sense of horror. It was the moment when the true gravity, the true weight of what Eren was doing became clear. Like my eyes had been opened and I was finally free to witness just how truly, existentially terrifying the rumbling was. It was what made me realize that even if Eren was doing this solely to defend his home from a belligerent enemy, it still wouldn't justify this. Hanji saying there's nothing that can justify genocide was a powerful moment. But seeing the destruction firsthand, intercut with Eren's admission that he's doing this for such a stupid reason, it really hammers home how senseless this whole thing was from the beginning. When I saw Walter admit to Skylar that the reason he went on this long was for himself, I felt chills. It felt like this was the first time since season 1 that Walter was being honest with his family. The scenes of Walter trying to skirt around telling Skylar the truth, where she comes this close to finding out, those were some of the tensest scenes in the entire show for me. And when he finally stops it all, stops the lies, stops the pretending, the self-aggrandizing, not only did it feel like a weight had finally been lifted from my neck, but it made me realize that this wasn't the first time he was being honest with Skylar in years. It was the first time he was being honest with us. Seeing that moment, it honestly helped leave a more positive impression of Walt. The last 2 seasons especially, he does some truly horrible stuff, so to see him not try and justify it anymore, to just come clean about it, it lets him go out with more dignity than he would have had otherwise. These are very different moments that invoke very different emotions, but they are contenders for my favourite moment in either series. They are only possible because the characters and the story acknowledge that these are people who have done awful things that can never be redeemed. And when people reduce them to Sigma male grindset goals out committing crimes because it looks cool, worse than making them shitty people, it just makes them boring. So many good moments, like the ones I just talked about and many others, either go out the window or become incredibly disingenuous. But it's more than just bad, it can also be dangerous. These characters bring with them topics like toxic masculinity, fascism, abuse, manipulation, violence, and if enough people misinterpret these characters as ultimately being in the right, then it can lead people down a pipeline they might not crawl out of. Which begs the question, is this misinterpretation the fault of the audience for just not getting it, or is it the fault of the author for not making it clear enough? If you'd asked me a couple years ago, I'd have said the audience, no doubt. An author shouldn't be forced to dumb down an intelligent, nuanced story for the sake of making sure people understand that no, you shouldn't start a terrorist organization where you beat each other up for fun. But as I've gotten older, I've become more aware of instances like this, and it's made me wonder whether authors do have a kind of responsibility to make sure their message is being got. Now, this isn't enough for me to blame a creator for people misinterpreting their work. Vince Gilligan obviously isn't to blame for people wanting to emulate a murderous drug kingpin, but I don't know. Perhaps I'm worrying too much. Maybe my trauma from the Attack on Titan fandom is clouding my judgment. I just fear that the dangerous ideas being tackled by these characters are being taken in entirely the wrong way, which risks spreading them when the story is in fact trying to stamp them out. I love characters like Walter White and Eren Yeager. I find them incredibly fascinating to watch, to analyze, to pick apart, to write. They're bad people, but they're nuanced and layered in a way that makes it impossible to look away, that makes you want to get in their heads and break down what exactly makes them tick. But because of that nuance, we really need to take care in how they're presented, in how we talk about them. If we've to keep having complex protagonists like them, we need to be approaching and appreciating them in an equally complex way. And while again, I don't want us to have to force writers to make their stories and characters simpler, I also think it wouldn't hurt for them to be aware of how their work could potentially be interpreted and perhaps accommodate for that. And as an audience, we need to appreciate that just because a character is a protagonist doesn't mean we have to root for or identify with them. We can love a character and not support their actions at the same time. You don't have to defend the undefendable just because you like them. Eren and Walter are both tragic, horrible people. If they existed in real life, no doubt they would be reviled as absolute monsters. And that's just how I like 'em. That's the end of the video, but if you want to help contribute to the creation of more, then you can pledge to my Patreon, where you get stuff like behind the scenes updates, director's commentaries, credits at the end of videos, and early access to my music as well as bonus tracks. I've recently added a goal where if we hit 50 patrons, I'll make a character analysis on Kai Shimada from Corpse Party, who is actually my namesake, a story I'm happy to get into if that video ever gets made. Links in the description below, but if not, then you can just buy my music on Bandcamp, donate one time to Ko-fi, and of course, like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'll see you soon. Bye bye. Oh, thank fuck. Woo.